Morning all. Let's have a look this morning at an important game in history of battles of man versus computer. The 1996 match between Deep Blue, created by IBM, and Garry Kasparov, who was the world chess champion at the time. The time control, 40 moves in 2 hours, standard time control. The computer playing white played e4. So e4, I think, generally is good for the brute force approach that computers use, calculating millions of positions a second. Kasparov chooses the Sicilian defense, not too concerned about his opponent's calculating abilities, perhaps. c3, not the sharpest choice to play. Bit surprising for a computer to play the c3 Sicilian and not, say, the open Sicilian. d5, an energetic response in the centre, which black can hope for equality sometimes, especially giving white an isolated queen's pawn sometimes in these Alpin variations. d4, knight f6. After knight f3, Kasparov chooses to pin this knight, not keeping the bishop inside the pawn chain with e6. So bishop g4, creating that pin on the f3 knight. Bishop e2, unpinning. e6. And now the computer kicks the bishop to h5. It goes to h5. The computer castles knight c6. After bishop e3, we see the isolated queen's pawn being created now after c takes d4, c takes d4. So structurally, this is a long-term liability. Although giving white temporarily a nice square for the knight, if this pawn can be blockaded, then black should have a very good game. Bishop b4 is played by Kasparov. The bishop strikes thin air from here. It's as though knight c3 is being discouraged. Maybe the option of taking on c3 is to be seriously considered. But the computer is not playing knight c3 here. The computer plays a3. After bishop a5, now knight c3. No, but the real intention is not to take on c3, but really just to reroute the bishop perhaps to this dangerous diagonal. We see here that with h3, white's dark squares have been slightly weakened, so getting the bishop on that diagonal is very interesting, potentially. We see now queen d6, which would support a battery potentially, but knight b5 needs to be factored in, which would fork these two pieces. In fact, in this position, knight b5 is played immediately, kicking the queen to e7. But black's grip on d5 has just been strengthened, with the knight not now helping for d5 support. However, the computer energetically plays knight e5 in this position, now attacking Kasparov's bishop on h5 and threatening to leave black with a backward pawn on the semi-open c file as well. Bishop takes e2, queen takes e2. And now Kasparov castles, not too concerned by knight takes c6. That would give him potentially b file pressure and a stronger blockade on d5, reinforced by the c6 pawn. Okay, rook ac1 is played instead, rook ac8. And now an annoying pin, actually, which exposes a downside of this bishop being on a5. Bishop g5. It is quite an annoying pin. How can black unpin here? Well, Kasparov is not intending to unpin. He just plays bishop b6. And now the computer plays a tactic which fractures Kasparov's pawn structure. Basically, bishop takes f6. Because here, if Kasparov plays queen takes f6, it would seem that knight d7 is winning the exchange, or worse, if the bishop's not protected. Pardon me, the bishop's not an issue, just winning the exchange. Okay, so Kasparov is forced to take with g takes f6. And now, in this position, knight c4, threatening to double pawns on the queen's side as well as creating also a frontal threat of d5, perhaps in some situations. So, does Kasparov retreat this bishop? No, he just plays rook fd8. We'll look at this in the second pass, the options, why the bishop couldn't have been retreated, or maybe it could have. So in the second pass through this game, we'll examine other options there, rather than knowing double pawns on the queen side. So the computer doubled Kasparov's pawns on the queen side now. So quite a lot of structural damage has been inflicted on black, but white remains with that isolated queen's pawn as well, which is now protected. And now we see f5, which gives black also queen f6, which will be another possibility for adding more pressure onto that isolated queen's pawn. Queen e3, not only defending it, but maybe these dark squares will be useful one day when they're not guarded to get onto black's king side. Queen f6. Okay, in this position we see one weakness forcibly swapped for another. The computer plays the forcing move d5, exposing an attack on b6 and offering up to get rid of the isolated queen's pawn. Also, you'll note b2 may be factored into this. For the moment, black plays rook takes d5. After rook takes d5, e takes d5. There isn't queen takes b6 immediately, so b2 is being factored in, not to be left on praise. b3. So here we have now a slightly uncomfortable position for black. His structure has been absolutely wrecked, diced. Double pawns isolated, 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 double pawns, 4 pawn islands. Well, you could include also these as 2 separate islands as well. So anyway, in this position, Kasparov is not really interested in trying to defend b6, not that he can anyway. It looks very difficult to defend b6, but we'll have to check that out in the second pass. He actually decides in this position to give up the b6 pawn. We'll look at various defensive possibilities, but this pin does not help matters either. For example, I believe knight e7, maybe just taking is strong, and after takes queen e8 check will be strong. But we'll check in the second pass what black's best move would be there. But the structure looks absolutely wrecked for white's pawn sacrifice. The possibility of also queen b2 looks somewhat interesting, but it does mean maybe the king is going to be slightly weakened if the queen goes away. So Kasparov's next move, king h8, is a much more aggressive option, turning this into a kind of gambit of a pawn to get a strong attack, well, visually a strong attack on white's king. It seems perfectly justified at some levels anyway to play this move, to use that g file. Why not? It's an open road to white's king. Queen takes b6 and we see rook g8. So a normal human opponent may be slightly concerned by this pressure, but the computer simply plays the cold move queen c5. So queen c5 is maintaining a battery on c6, and if b7 drops, then c6 is a liability. Also, it is attacking d5 as well, so it's with a kind of tempo. In fact, Kasparov moves his pawn. He doesn't try and threaten mate or anything with queen g5, for example. He just, for the moment, he moves this pawn to d4. Okay, and now off the knight d6, we do see this threat of knight takes b7, potentially queen takes c6 will then be threatened. Also, of course, f5 is attacked as an option as well from the knight and queen. So Kasparov tries here to play for the attack with f4, and things are looking really dangerous visually, like with f3 coming in, and that would be like a very dangerous pawn in the white king side's area, which Kasparov might consider an extra piece. Sometimes in his annotation is often referring to pawns like this as an extra piece, virtually an attacking piece, but Okay, let's see. Knight takes b7, and the knight's now loose, and it comes into the attack as well with knight e5. If queen takes d4, then knight f3 check would win the queen. So the computer calmly plays queen d5, which, okay, it eyes f7, which means actually knight d6, and maybe queen takes e5 would be on, because then if queen takes, we would have knight takes f7 check. So that kind of tactical idea, for example, it's also protecting g2, but not for long now. f3, breaking that connection with g2, g3, and now knight d3. This seems to be getting very dangerous for white's king, but the computer goes forward now with the rook, leaving the back row exposed, potentially, just going for its own attack. And Kasparov can switch now from the G file to the E file, which he does with rook E8, trying to exploit that weakness of the last move, that getting the rook away from the back row. Now we see a move which the computer calculated to be very strong, very cold, clinical calculation, inviting seemingly very, very dangerous threats. After knight d6, the rook is invited in with check, and now after king h2, Kasparov plays knight takes f2, and he's just one move away from mating the white king. Unfortunately, there are a number of forcing moves available for white here, which means this is very close but maybe very far at the same time, given white's availability of forcing moves. And the first one is knight takes f7 check. So the problem here, well, what is the problem here? We should look at queen takes f7 and set and pass, because that in theory might be possible, you think, because of the rook h1 check. But in practice, there's other checks available to white on queen takes f7. For example, queen d4 might be a strong move, but we'll check that out in the second pass. Kasparov thought that this move was the best, king g7, but he's walking straight into a discovered check. So knight g5, discovered check. He moves his king now to h6, but now there's rook takes h7 check, and here it's very, very clear all of a sudden that, well, to Kasparov at least, that his king is in real trouble. He resigned here. Now let's go through this game set and pass, starting from this position, to see exactly what is going on. Why did Kasparov actually resign here? So turning on Houdini, or trying to. So if king g6, check, king f5. Remarkably, in this position, Houdini thinks the strongest move is taking the pawn, which gives white some freedom to play king g2. It gets rid of this rook h1 threat in this position. Rather cheeky. And the other variation comes down to taking on f3, it seems, as well, with check and taking on f3. So we'll take on f3. So it attacks the rook, and also, of course, there's now rook f7, so it's basically a double attack, and it's sorted out black's threat. So what does black do here in this position? It looks pretty grim all of a sudden without that mate threat. If check, king g2, the best move is given as king e4. Rook h4 check, king e3. Queen e8 check, king d3. In this position, rook takes d4 check, And the best move for black is queen takes, which doesn't look good. Otherwise, say king c2, then check. Just take on f2. White's king is really safe. Black's getting mated as well. So let's go back to that final position. It seems as though it wasn't even to do directly with a mate of the black king here. It just time in this position to take on f3, believe it or not, leaving black completely lost because of things like rook f7. What else does black play here? If he plays, I don't know, knight e4, I think we just play rook f7, or queen g4 is mate, pardon me. So the knight can't move. If rook f1, I think we just play rook f7, or there's actually a mate and fork check. Yeah, that's no good. Oh dear, oh dear. So basically, yeah, the final position looks lost, but what about earlier? What was going on here? Why not? Okay, we'll get to that, but well, let's just get a sneak preview here. On queen takes f7, key move here, queen d8 check. Right, so if queen g8, then it is mating black with like check or taking on here and then mating. And if king g7, then I think we just take on f7. Okay, and now queen d5 check. Well, I think just taking on f3 will do here. That's winning in the king and pawn ending, or is it? It's not mentioned by the engine. Queen takes f3, yes. Third choice, yes. That will do in this position. Black hasn't got a compensating pawn or anything. No, that's pretty hopeless, this position. Okay, so let's rewind and see when was white actually better in this game. Or white had a small advantage here. We get the classic isolated queen's pawn. Slightly risky looking move bishop b4. In terms of that pin later, which incurred a lot of structural damage, that pin on f6. So knight c3. His bishop takes c3 is actually mentioned as a possibility. Maybe it's not so crazy to give up the dark square bishop. But queen d6 is given a stronger what Kasparov played. Knight b5. Now queen e7, which does set up this pin for white, potentially. But it's not used in this position. Bishop g5. I think bishop g5 is not so hot in this position. Just castles, okay. Right, but so knight e5 first. And if bishop g6, okay, rook c1, and white seems to have a lot of pressure here brewing up. So black takes on e2, queen takes, and now castles. Rook ac1, rook ac8, and now this pin, bishop b6, and now the computer goes for it with bishop takes f6. So was bishop b6 actually an inaccuracy? To stop the bishop f6 tactic, something like rook fd8 actually looks as though that's relevant for not only eyeing the isolated queen's pawn, but stopping bishop f6 and knight d7. It seems white's advantage is minimal here. On takes, for example, here, it's no big deal, perhaps. This position is no big deal. So Kasparov seems to invite bishop takes f6, getting his pawns doubled. So we see knight c4, and you might think, oh, is this pawn on prey? I don't think it is because of queen g4. So knight takes, and if bishop takes, we've got queen g4 check, winning that bishop there. So, and if the bishop goes back, is there something like d5 or something, or queen g4? Apparently there is d5 here. d5, and now again queen g4 has got the rook in sight here on c8. First, even stronger apparently is to attack the queen. Yeah, and then win that exchange. And that'll be better for white. So this d5 is actually quite dangerous as a possibility in this position if the bishop had retreated. If the bishop goes to c7, is it still bad? Not so bad. The rook's not loose here in bishop c7. So does white have pressure? Check. Thrown the check. Knight takes. Queen takes. And again, d5 is a useful move here. E takes. Queen f5 threatens queen f6 and maybe swinging a rook in. That does seem quite dangerous. So it's be regaining the pawn here. So it's got rid of its structural issue and left black with the double pawn. So white's better here. Okay, so basically after knight c4, Kasparov chose rook fd8, which might be a lesser evil move. In fact, Houdini really likes rook fd8 here, just offering up double pawns on the queen side. Okay, then we see rook fd1, f5. Again, that's liked by Houdini a little bit. Queen e3, queen f6. And then let's move d5, which Houdini does like. d5. Getting rid of the isolated queen's pawn. Getting black's b6 in return. But not immediately. So b3 is actually a strong move here. Just getting rid of black's, extinguishing black's threat before taking the option out of taking the pawn. If queen b2 here, strong move rook c3 is mentioned. That would interrupt the diagonal rook c3 for that queen, meaning that maybe queen g5 and rook g3 is becoming stronger. So let's go with this d4. Check, check, check with knight supporting the queen. Rook g3, very dangerous. Now check here. Winning the exchange, it's very dangerous. So b3, queen b2 looks as though rook c3. What can black do here? If it doesn't do, if it d4, well, that knight's pinned. Say knight e7, trying to challenge the rook. Then actually taking here is possible apparently. Rook takes. Check, and then check here to regain that rook. Whoa, so this is not looking good. This rook c3 seems a very powerful resource in this position. If king h8, queen g5, so known as queen f6 as a threat with that interrupted diagonal. f4 check. In this position, knight d6 now threatening f7. So preferring a check to get back. Check. Take that. And take the rook, of course. So, yes. So queen b, given queen b2 is not on. Kasparov, he tried king h8, which looks like the best move anyway. Houdini really likes king h8. As though the advantage is absolutely minimised almost after king h8. We're talking 0.11 at depth 17. So here it seems black was fine at this depth with king h8 offering up b6. So even with the fragmented pawn structure, which the computer must have evaluated as good for itself, the dynamism of the g-file here is compensating for the fragmented pawn structure. Clearly, visually, it looks like a really dangerous attack. Now the computer didn't take on b7, would it actually have got mated? Queen g5 attacking c1 and g2 is clear enough, just winning a rook. So that explains perhaps queen c5 does mean queen g5 is not a double attack on g2 and c1. Okay, So the move d4 is played, which apparently is a blunder from Kasparov. Here, it was about dead equal, it seems, with f4. f4 is the move. If f4, okay, rook d1, d4. Why not just take, you might wonder? In this position, queen g7, threat to the mate, is very difficult to parry without having to play a horrible move like g4. That looks horrendous. But apparently, apparently this is okay for, nearly okay for white. With king e1, black is running out of attacking resources. This might actually be okay for the computer in this variation. But f4, so it seems like a powerful move here to keep the balance. So what is the actual, what are more ideas apart? If we don't play rook d1, we play queen c3, d4, now knight e5, f3, g4 here, d3, rook c5, let's go with d2 here. It looks as though black's holding the balance here. It's tricky, but black's holding balance. If rook takes here, maybe. Okay, what happens here? Queen h6, hitting the rook at h3, and that's actually better for black if white's forced to play rook d8 here. So, okay, it seems that f4 looks like a key improvement. For some reason, technical reasons, d4 is no good. Because of, well, knight d6 gives white the advantage here. So you might ask, well, what is actually going on here? Why on f4? Why not knight d6 here? Apparently rook g6 is the answer here. So why isn't rook g6 available after d4? What's the difference? Let's try and work this out like a detective. So knight d6 here, on rook g6, there's knight takes f5. White apparently is better here. Just once more though, okay, we'll go with f4, knight d6, pardon me, d4, knight d6, rook g6. Isn't there knight takes f5 here? Yes, but f4, knight d6, rook g6. There's no knight f5. Pardon me. Here's the subtlety. Because the pawn is actually a useful resource to stop the queen supporting f5. That's the key thing here. Okay, so that explains why f4 might be black's saving move in this position. f4 can answer knight d6, can evict the knight with rook g6. And the other question is, what about, the knight takes b7 idea? Is that rendered useless? In this position, queen g5 apparently is very powerful. Okay, what does white do here against g2? White seems to be getting smashed. It just looks as though the king getting absolutely wrecked. Yeah, there's no problem. Lots of threats against the white king here. d3, knight f3. So, okay, it seems like Kasparov did have dynamic counterplay after all, and this is a absolutely crucial blunder in the history of man versus computer, that he played actually d4 here, which basically gave the queen access to f5 for knight d6 to be more effective than it needed to be, basically, if we can do a summation there. So the move f4 would hold the balance. So under d4, knight d6 is now an effective move, unfortunately, for mankind. So after f4, okay, knight takes b7 here. I guess it's no good to threaten mate in this position. We saw Kasparov play knight e5. If he tries to threaten mate with queen g6, not g5, it can be taken. Unfortunately, in this position, there's another point. Another subtle point is here. Look, there's a diagonal defense with queen takes c6. Oh dear. So this d4 contains terrible implications from the black perspective for white being able to defend g2 now across the diagonal. If the pawn was still on d5, we'd be blocking that route, defensive route. Here, it's just losing a piece for black. Okay, so that's pretty horrendous situation there, where now knight takes b7 is actually possible. Okay, so here queen d5, f3. You saw g3. White's better here. Now this doesn't help black, knight d3, but maybe black's in a terrible state right now. If you try d3, queen d4, nasty pin, rook d1, getting away from that attack, knight c5. It looked so dangerous for white's king because of that pawn on f3. If we take on d3, is this just hopeless for white for some reason? Yes. Yes. Knight f4 just attacks the queen and protects g2. So close but so far in these variations. Just seems that black's got all of his pieces attacking white's king, but white is finding clinical defences. So maybe Kasparov saw some of this and now is committed to this threat of mate in one, which doesn't mean much because white's got all of these forcing moves now. After knight takes f7, it's all winning, isn't it? Now if rook e7, okay, let's check out rook e7. I don't think that helps. Rook e7 is strong, but in fact even stronger is knight e6 check. So what's happening here? If king f7, well, knight f4 check, that's going into that horrendous, that would win the queen. You can't go into that horrendous f7 square. If king h6, in this position, without any threat against white's king, rook c6 now threatens skewer, which is difficult apparently to get out of. It's very difficult. The king can't get out of that skewer. Nothing seems to help this skewer. If that's the best move, that's not very nice. Okay, so rook e7 is not helping black, so we have to keep the mating threat, but it's hopeless. And not for the reason of mating the black king, which maybe is what one would have first expected, but rather just extinguishing black's major threat in the position tactically. Being able to just take this pawn, extinguishing the threat of mate on h1, leaving black absolutely helpless now with his king there facing skewers. Okay, now the importance of this game It's the first game a computer basically beat a reigning world champion under normal chess tournament conditions. So the standard time control of 40 moves in 2 hours. It does demonstrate brute force and not really being scared of anything. Even imminent mate in one, the computers just calculated it all as being just simply better without any emotion. Being able to come back and round up that f3 pawn, leaving black hopelessly lost. In this particular 1996 match, for those not familiar, Kasparov bounced back after this. Over the next 5 games, he won 3 and drew 2 to soundly beat the machine in the 1996 match. Unfortunately, it was in a later match against what Kasparov would nickname Deeper Blue that things didn't go so well. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.